And so for our final speaker for today's session, we have Amy McKinney. Amy is a fourth-generation Montanan and a graduate of Carroll College. She's also, she works as an associate professor of history at Northwest College in Powell, Wyoming, where she teaches classes on U.S. history, Western women, and the North American West. She'll speak today about the life, letters, and poetry of Montana's first woman poultry specialist, and I did confirm it is poultry specialist, in her talk, Dear People, the Letters and Poetry of Harriette Cushman. So without further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much. Always an adjustment of the mic, right? So thank you for being here. Welcome. One thing I would like to start with, I normally don't present in a t-shirt, but today is Orange Shirt Day. So it's in recognition and remembrance of the Indigenous children who went to boarding and residential schools. So if you don't know about boarding schools, I would take this opportunity to learn more, because that's what today is about, is that recognition. I want to recognize two other Montanans you should know who are in the audience. One is Heather, who worked closely with me when I was at Special Collections in Bozeman doing the research for Harriette Cushman, and then my mentor, Dr. Bob Schwartout. He set my path very much so when I was at Carroll College. So just a shout out to both of them for all of the help that they've given me. So definitely I see Harriette Cushman as a Montanan you should know. She was very much a very unique personality, a strong personality. She was anything but ordinary. And one thing that I always kind of focus on with her is the fact that I put her in the context of a new woman, that turn of the century, early 1900s, women who were coming into that notion of being able to vote, that they were having more and more having college degrees. They wanted professional careers. Harriette Cushman herself did extensive traveling with her job. She never married, and she also was someone who had a passion for the outdoors. So she was not your typical housewife. She wasn't someone who wanted only that in her life. She very much was part of that larger kind of new woman movement. What I think is really significant about her is that we're taking that idea of the new woman and putting it into a rural space. Most talk about new women, talks about urban women, but here we have a professional woman in agriculture. So I think that really sets her apart and very much so puts her on that path to becoming an incredibly influential person in the state of Montana. She's most known for her role in the Extension Service. She was, like the title says, the first woman to be a topic specialist for the Cooperative Extension Service. She was the poultry specialist in Montana from 1922 to 1955. She had a rough start starting her career, but she definitely settled in Montana and made it her home. She is very much the person then responsible for setting up a lot of the kind of the key components of the poultry program in Montana. Couple of highlights from her career. She was the spearhead person behind starting a turkey cooperative in Montana. She also was the one who wanted to get higher quality eggs and devised the Montana Extra Select as a key feature of Montana poultry. She did a lot of work with improving and building better ventilated chicken houses, and just the basics of care that you need for a healthy flock. So things like culling were what became more kind of standardized practice. So those are all things that she did in her professional career. But what I want to focus on today was, her passion for writing and her passion especially for poetry. So a lot of that passion came from her upbringing. So she was born in 1890 in Alabama, but she grew up in Jamestown, New York. Her parents always from the start were very, very supportive of her getting her education, going to college. So initially she went to Mount Holyoke, where she wanted to get her degree in English and become a writer. But when she was there, she was not excelling in the place where she wanted to be. Where she was showing a lot of promise was science. And so her mentor encouraged her to switch gears and go into science. So she transferred to Cornell University and in 1914 received a degree in chemistry and bacteriology. So one thing I like to make note of that, 1914, she gets her college degree. That is also the year that the Smith-Lever Act was passed that created the Extension Service. So I think that that parallel is really interesting. So she definitely loved her job when she set out as poultry specialist in Montana. She was very well known. She was very much respected, but it always was something a little bit missing for her because, again, her passion was writing. When you look at her letters home to her parents, that's a common theme throughout a lot of what she's talking about. She's talking about ways to be able to continue writing. She's talking about all of the time that she has spent either reading poetry written by other people or working on her own poems. She traveled extensively throughout the state with her job. She averaged 100 days on the road, typically. 1935 was a busy year for her. She spent 218 days in the field. So with all of that traveling, most of it was by train. And so she used that opportunity to do a lot of writing when she was traveling on the train. And she really looked at a very demanding job. And this was her outlet. You know, she's like, if I want something for myself, that's poetry. So anytime she could steal away some time to be able to be creative and work on her poetry, that's what she did. And like I said, in her letters home, that was a big part of the discussion. She always started her letters home, dear people, and then would talk about her job, talk about her travels. And like I said, all of her letters are peppered with poetry. I mean, that becomes a very key point to it. Like I said, she never married, but there's not many times that she really discussed longing to be married. She speaks more so about the fact that she was an independent woman. She wasn't willing to give up her independence. And probably one of the main reasons that she didn't marry, at least what she told her parents, what she's telling them, she was very, very intelligent. She loved having intelligent conversations with people. And as the poultry specialist, she worked predominantly with men. And there were different county agents that she formed an intellectual relationship with. And she loved talking to them about politics or literature or poetry or music. And she said she wasn't willing to be able to give up those kinds of discussions because if she married, then it would only be appropriate for her to speak to her husband. So if she's single, then she has the freedom to be able to continue these discussions with a variety of people. The one time that she said, basically, I wish I was married, because she said if she was married, then she could write. You know, that would free her up to be able to write. She did talk about with her career that, you know, if she is single and has to support herself, that this is a quote that she writes to her parents. Oh, how I would like to be able to write. Even if I had to lower my standards of living considerably, there would be a great deal more satisfaction. So her friends and family definitely knew that this was just a huge part of her personality, a big part of what was near and dear to her. So her friends and family, they would get together, they would talk poetry. She oftentimes would send people poems for presents. She really wanted to get beyond her friend circle. And so she looked for ways to be able to talk about her poems, recite her poems. So she spoke to any organization that would have her. She was most proud that she was invited to read some of her poems on public radio. She looked constantly for ways to be published. A lot of her poems were published in local newspapers, but then she also later on was published quite frequently from the publication from Montana Arts Institute. So I want to spend the rest of the talk looking specifically at some of her poems. There are definite themes that come out in her poetry, and one overarching theme that you see throughout her collection is the love of nature and the outdoors. She was passionate about being able to get outside. Any chance she had to get out with her group of friends, most of them other professional women who worked at the Extension Service, most of them in the home demonstration side. They're constantly talking about jumping in the car and going for a hike, going for a picnic. So she notes a lot about nature and hiking throughout her poems. So I selected this one because it talks specifically about hiking and the trail, and kind of ties together a lot of that love of nature, love of being in the outdoors. So I just for the sake of time, I'm not going to read all the poems, but I hope to have put the font big enough that you can read them. So this is the first stanza, again, talking about the trail being a fickle thing, but what draws her to it? You know, why is this trail so appealing? And I think these photographs really kind of cement why these types of topics were so important to her. So being able to be outdoors, but, you know, again, maybe taking her away from what she should be doing, but is much more fun to be outside on the trail. She hiked a lot with a distinct group of friends. They were not casual hikers. I mean, they went on some pretty impressive hikes. This one was a 12-mile climb on, you know, with packs, with everything. And by far my most favorite picture of Harriette Cushman in Glacier Park. And again, looking at what she sees, what is around her, and what links her to that. So nature and the outdoors was, again, by far the most common thread that you see in the collection of her poems. But because she had to work for a living, she also had to look for ways to be able to incorporate that passion for writing into her day job. So one thing I just absolutely love about Cushman is the fact that she could take her work with the Extension Service and be able to provide poetry about her work in her official reports to the Extension Service. So she had, like, this one comes from her 1929 report, the first page, the introduction to the annual report, where she is giving the breakdown of her time. So how much was in the office, how much was doing demonstrations, all of that. And so she made it into a poem. So she has the visual, and when she looked at that pie chart, what she saw was that wagon wheel. And so being able to make that connection and start off her report with a poem about how she spends her time over the course of that year. This one, I think, is, again, one of my favorites. This comes from her 1935 report. So she is writing about all of the various things that she's responsible for. And one of that is the poultry program. She's specifically talking about the push for Montana Select Eggs and trying to convince Montanans that poultry and eggs are important. And so she writes in her report kind of this historical viewpoint of the place of poultry in Montana's history. This one I will read because I think it's really interesting how she ties a bunch of things together. So Montana was a mining camp, and then cattle came. And many of those that thought our state would never be the same. Though sheep and cattle filled the range, there still was fields to take. And so the land was filled by those who thought they surely make their stake from golden grain. But all the way, the lowly hen, she'd pay the grocery bill. Though wheat goes up and wheat goes down, she's sure to pay still. They make great plans to save the wheat with such as AAA during the Depression, but nothing's done for our old hen because hens ain't built that way. They thrive in drought and or rain. They say she's still a livestock state and you cannot alter nature, and poultry's just a little thing with men in legislature. But why the outfits fuss and bout, saying hens ain't worth a candle, just because they can't drill hen seed in or farm them from the saddle. Montana's poultry's on the game. So one thing that she was really struggling with through her work was to convince people that poultry was legitimate as far as an agricultural pursuit. And one thing that she clearly demonstrated during the Depression through the turkey cooperatives was just that. I mean, turkey saved a lot of Montanans through the Depression. And she's really struggling to kind of get street cred for poultry, and showing that here's something that most people just kind of cast aside as pin money, or something that just to be able to buy extras. She's saying this is a substantial part of Montana's agriculture, and no one's really recognizing that. So she reflects on that in her annual report through poetry. So she also, beyond her annual report, was responsible for a lot of writings that were sent out throughout the state. So her annual turkey letter was sent mainly to poultry farmers to provide them with the newest information that the Extension Service had regarding how to tend to your flock. So she would start a lot of her turkey letters with a poem. So this one is looking at fall, looking at the changing of the leaves, the shift in the season. And so she frames it with that, and then she goes into, okay, so now what does that mean? What is that? If you have a turkey flock, you're going to have to start thinking about different vegetation to feed them. You're going to have to, so she leads into the information she wants to give them with a poem. So that definitely was a key aspect of how she was able to link her passion for poetry to reach the public and to be able to give out some valuable information to them. So that's another kind of key area of her poetry. Also related to her work, she went to all 7 reservations in Montana and gave the same kind of information and programming to the indigenous people of Montana. She was very well respected by the tribes. In fact, she was even adopted in 1955. She was given the name Eagle's Word, that translates to Eagle's Word, because many of the tribes understood that poultry was bringing in stability for them. And they called her Eagle's Word because she was talking to them about birds, and the bird that they most revere is the eagle. So making that connection. So adopted by the tribe in 1955. Throughout her career, she very much was doing work that she could to help support Native Americans. That definitely continues when she retires. She was one of the key people who started work to try to create a Native American Center at Montana State. A considerable amount of her estate went to establish a scholarship for Native American students. And so another big part of her poems is about Native Americans. Most of them talking about ceremonies. She herself was invited to attend 3 different sun dances, but she also talked about just like the ways of life. I picked this one because it's funny and poignant and short. But I love this, kind of misconceptions about Native Americans, right? So, Madam Indian children do not act that way. So very much so an advocate for Native Americans. Again, I mentioned this briefly before, because this was such a huge part, she often used poetry to commemorate birthdays and celebrations. So a lot of times she would send poems as gifts. One thing I think is really interesting is she developed it into her Christmas cards. So she had a Christmas card list ready of 700 people because of all the contacts she had around the state. So she's a very practically and efficient woman. And so she created these Christmas cards. The photographs are ones that she took as she traveled across the state, and then she would write a poem, and then that would be her Christmas card. So these are some with her photography. Later on, she did her own drawings. I think a lot of these is more after she retired, probably didn't have the same cash flow to be able to do the photographs. But that was a common thing that she gave as gifts. She also created calendars. So the 4 seasons, this one, the 4 tribes in Montana. So all the poems for this particular calendar have some focus on Native Americans. A lot of the other ones just deal with the seasons. So in her retirement is really where she was able to focus on her writing. She had been a member, she was a charter member of the Montana Institute of the Arts in 1948. She held numerous offices while she was part of that organization. And while she was part of it, she was writing poems. She herself won 6 times won the awards for her poetry and short stories, 2-time recipient of the Marion Bread and Clap Poetry Award. She won first place with the Montana Institute for the Arts many times. And one of the things that she said was one of the greatest honors. She said she had 2 great honors in her life. One was when she was named an Arts Fellow for the Montana Institute for the Arts in 1960. And then 3 years later, in 1963, she was awarded an honorary doctorate from MSU. So those were her big benchmarks. She combined her passion for Native Americans in her retirement, again, with trying to establish that Center for Native Americans at MSU. And so she did say that she would write for money. She didn't do it for herself. So she's not looking at, in her retirement, anything that she would write, she was trying to get money for that center. She wrote her entire life. She had just 10 days before she passed away, she had just received notice that she was accepted for another publication. So she wrote almost to the day she died. So again, that passion that she brings out, but how she ties together all of her life and being able to use her job and use her position to educate and also express herself in a way that she couldn't through her day job. So thank you.